Well, I'm really pleased to be here with my friend Philip Howard. Philip is an attorney, but he's written a long series of books about the way that the government works, and so that includes Try Common Sense. So why don't you actually, this
Well,
began
my
a while
first
ago.
book, my first book was The Death of Common Sense.
Yes.
Much to my wife's surprise, it
Yeah.
became a big bestseller, and that was almost 30 years ago. And since I've dug down even deeper into why it is that we don't let people use their common sense. And I had a book called The Rule of Nobody
Right.
about 10 years ago, which was about the role of human judgment in law. So we created these modern legal structures that assume people don't need to exercise their judgment.
Right,
That's simply not true. Law is values and judgment and stuff, and you have to give people the authority to do that. And the most recent book, which came out this year, 2024,
Yeah, which is right here.
it's called Everyday Freedom, and in it, all 84 pages of it, I try to sort of strip away argument and actually declare what I think are truths about why this current system has to fail, and why what America's suffering from could be characterized as system failure, and requires a new narrative to actually change the system.
Okay, so let's start with that. What is the source of that system failure, and what do you mean by a term like everyday freedom?
Right. So I think most of the problems of government are not problems of policy disagreement, but are problems of execution. The principal can't run a good school, and if it's bad, he can't fix it. The teacher doesn't have authority to run a classroom. Healthcare uses 30% of the dollar in administration. That's over $1 million per doctor in red tape. Why is that? Why is all that money going to red tape? You've written about infrastructure and what you call the vetocracy. We have this system of government that doesn't let, where it's almost impossible to get a permit for an interstate transmission line, which are desperately needed to bring energy from the renewable sources, like the wind farms in the Midwest, to the cities, because there's too many jurisdictions and there are too many overlapping interest groups and such, so nothing happened. So all these are failures of execution. They're not failures of policy. And ultimately, they're failures of execution, I argue, because the people in charge actually don't have the freedom the everyday freedom to make the choices needed to make them work.
Yeah, they can't use their own judgment, and instead you've got a lot of rules that constrain them to just follow rules, and that's really what drives people crazy about bureaucracy.
Yes, and I break it down into three components, all of which, three conventions of law that got changed after the 1960s in order to, in an effort to avoid unfair choices. And what we ended up doing is avoiding fair choices. We're avoiding any choices, like a giant precautionary principle. But the three new conventions were the idea that rule books would not only tell people what the goal was and give them principles, but actually tell them how to do it. So we have 1,000-page rule books that have people going around through the day with their noses in rule books instead of actually solving problems.
And we can actually give some examples of that, like the federal acquisition regulations. If anybody, a purchasing manager in any government agency, wants to buy, a stapler or a computer, they've got all of these thousands of pages of instructions about exactly how to do that.
Literally volumes on a shelf of how to do everything. And the second convention was where you couldn't have a rule that tells you exactly how to do things. You could have a process where you could demonstrate what's correct. That also in procurement. You have to give everybody a fair chance. Everybody has a chance to complain. You have to have all the specs laid out in advance, which means that the system is almost designed to fail because there's no iterative, innovation, particularly in new products and such, is very iterative. And you can't, particularly things like IT, you can't lay it all out in advance. And so we have environmental review, which is a good idea, but not a good idea if it becomes no pebble left unturned, and it lasts for 6 or 8 years. Then it's harmful to the environment. You don't actually build the transmission lines. And then the third thing was this kind of inversion of the idea of individual rights, where instead of being rights against state power, taking your property away without due process of law or putting you in jail, it became a right of anybody who didn't like something to complain and throw a monkey wrench. And so now you have one neighbor, it's one NIMBY neighbor who doesn't like the project. They start a lawsuit. There's another 5 years.
Yeah. Well, if we could talk about this specifically in the context of my state of California, we have this law called CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, which empowers or gives standing to all 40 million residents of California to sue any project they want anonymously with no statute of limitations. And they've had, I think, about 118,000 CEQA lawsuits just in the last decade. Everything gets sued in this state.
Yes, that's right. So you end up having a government which, in the name of trying to avoid bad decisions, can make no decisions. And you end up with these projects. You know, you end up with I think it was maybe a public restroom in San Francisco that was going to cost $1.5 million. I think the process alone was like $800,000 of costs, legal costs, just to build a public restroom. So it's become a kind of, the closest thing analogous it would be, I think, in Gulliver's Travels, written in the 17th century, it's out of the Swift, where you have these crazy lands. So there's one called Legato where nothing happens except pursuant to a theory. So no one is actually, so somebody has a theory that you should build the roof first and then build the house. Well, it doesn't work out that well, right? But that was their theory, and they had some logic to it. And so he goes through this land of theory where no one's being practical, and of course nothing works, right? And that's sort of what America's become, the land of legato, where nobody can do anything, and with all kinds of baleful consequences, not only for government, but to the culture.
Nicholas Bagley, who's now a law professor at Michigan, had been Governor Gretchen Whitmer's chief legal advisor, and he wrote this, I think, very penetrating article, basically making a very similar point that liberals especially want to use government to do things, but they think that legitimacy comes from procedures, and in order to make things more legitimate, they add procedure on top of procedure to the point that you don't actually get any good outcomes from all of this.
Yes, and that's clearly correct. And so what I argue in Everyday Freedom is a truth that prior generations of humans knew, but we have forgotten, which is that really nothing happens successfully unless a human makes it happen. Even on assembly lines, like Toyota has really good assembly lines, they empower the workers to stop the assembly line if something's wrong. They all gather together and figure out what's wrong, and how to fix it right there. And most of life is not like an assembly line. And teaching a classroom is incredibly complex. Most jobs are complex. Every infrastructure project involves unavoidable trade-offs. Everyone has environmental impact, everyone. And so the question is the benefit worth the trade-off? Well, you can generally analyze those things in a big picture way in 50 or 100 pages, not thousands of pages and years of, again, no pebble left unturned, right? So, but we have forgotten. It's almost as if we've become a sort of a collective pathology where we don't understand that human judgment is important in anything, and that judgment is not actually objective. It's an instinct. It's decision making comes out of our unconscious, and our unconscious is like a quantum computer, and our rational mind, what we think about, it's like an 8-bit processor. And it can be helpful in sifting through our instincts and judgments and experience and training and all of that. It's all lodged in our unconscious. But people have to be able to act on their judgments, whether it's the teacher in the classroom or the president. And we've created this crazy system where no one can. And then we wonder why nothing works.
Yeah. So it's interesting, the political and ideological positioning of your argument, because on the one hand, you sound like a conservative when you complain about the burdensome nature of permitting and, government rules and so forth. But in another sense, what you're basically saying is that the people need, through their elected representatives, actually need to delegate more authority to people in the government to use their judgment to, rather than following detailed rule books, to exercise, judgment, or you could call it just discretion. And that's something that conservatives complain about all the time. The deep state is out of control, and you have all these unelected bureaucrats that are constantly making decisions.
Yes, I think both. I'm trying to offend both sides.
Yeah.
So conservatives had this idea, which was clearly incorrect, that authority and freedom are a zero-sum game. The more authority, the less freedom. That's actually inaccurate.
Mm-hmm.
If the teacher in the classroom doesn't have authority to maintain order, the freedom of the other children to learn is gone.
Mm-hmm.
If the environmental official doesn't have the authority to actually say what's important in this case is to study this, that, and the other, and do that in 100 pages and 3 months from now,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then all of a sudden nobody gets a permit,
Mm-hmm.
and we don't get the clean or the efficient energy
Mm-hmm.
because no one gets. But that's solely a function of the authority. If the judge in the courtroom doesn't exercise the authority, be active, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
to say when there's a suit because the kid fell off a seesaw, let's say, broke his leg, said, if I allow the suit to go forward, doesn't matter what the jury does,
Mm-hmm.
all the seesaws will be disputed. So I have to make a legal ruling about whether seesaws are a reasonable risk for
Mm-hmm.
kids of a certain age.
Mm-hmm.
And if the judge doesn't exercise that authority, nobody's free to go on the seesaw. And if the judge doesn't dismiss claims over somebody claiming that they didn't get a good job reference or something,
Mm-hmm.
then nobody will give a job reference.
Mm-hmm.
And that's happened in this country.
Yeah.
No established business will give a job reference. So people have literally lost their freedom. The university president doesn't enforce norms of civil discourse. People aren't free on the campus to actually say, I disagree with you. And that's happened too. So authority and freedom are not a zero-sum game.
Mm-hmm.
Freedom, and writ large, freedom only exists because of a framework of law.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have a framework of law saying no theft, no pollution, no whatever, you have anarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the strong man ruling. So the same thing is true with institutions, except that the boundaries are the norms and standards. So we've lost the conservatives lost the idea of authority and freedom, and I just want to offend liberals for a second. And what the liberals got the idea of is that you could actually create a form of central planning to make everything correct. There was one correct way of doing things. And the wonderful Czech playwright and president Václav Havel wrote about this a lot. He said, life isn't a crossword puzzle to be solved in one correct way. You've got to give people the agency, the 1,000 ways to skin a cat, all that. You've got to give people the freedom and the dignity of doing it in their own way.
Yeah. I can foresee many ways in which your argument, which I completely agree with, can be misinterpreted, beginning with your use of the word authority, because people say, oh, Philip Howard is an authoritarian. He wants more authority. And I think it needs to be clarified that you're not talking about a single centralized source of authority at the top. I mean, what you're talking about is authority to actually execute on things.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm glad you raised that. What I mean by authority is not what a lawyer would call discretion. In other words, I don't think that somebody should have the discretion, the authority to do whatever they want. So everyone ought to be subject to the views of someone else, in my view. It's like a 360-degree accountability mechanism. And it's very easy to put in checks and balances. I had an argument with the head of the teachers union once. I said, well, teachers need due process rights. And I said, well, what you call due process rights is you can never get rid of a bad teacher. That's not good for the students. Why don't we have a parent-teacher committee and give that committee the power to veto what they think are unfair decisions by the principal? That's fine. And so in that world, I would use the word, the principal has the authority to decide who's a good teacher, but there's a check and a balance. the parent-teacher committee can veto it if they think it's unfair.
Mm-hmm.
And you could have very similar mechanisms that you and I will be talking about in other contexts to protect against unfair judgments in a variety of ways. So it should never be someone has the authority of a dictator.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's I just don't know what the right word is.
Yeah.
Agency?
But then you've got this problem that in many systems you actually have too many veto points. This is something that I've labeled vetocracy, where
Right.
you know you want to prevent the abuse of discretionary authority, and so you create a check, but then you keep adding more checks to
Right.
it, such that you actually can't get to a decision.
Yes, that's right. And so you have to balance, as in all things in life, you have to balance what we have now as this pervasive distrust
Mm-hmm.
of any decision by anybody in our society.
Mm-hmm.
And as you point out, the whole idea, which the historian Eric Foner said, that after the 1960s, we changed our system of government to be a rejection of all forms of authority.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it doesn't work. It actually, everybody's freedom diminished because of that. So the question is, how do you create the system? And I think, in general, except for the most important decisions, there should be one check.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there should be, for procurement, for example, it's very complicated to and a lot of money involved to modernize government IT systems.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the people in charge ought to have much more discretion, and, flexibility.
Yeah. By the way, I'm not offended by the use of the word discretion.
Right.
There are many
Anyway,
people that would be, but
But I would have, in exchange for giving the procurement officers almost complete freedom to negotiate with it, I would create a kind of a business oversight committee that had to approve it at the end of the day.
mm-hmm.
And the person would have to say, here's why I made these decisions to spend this $10 billion on this new system for cybersecurity or whatever. This is why we think it's right. Here's all the flexibility built into it. Do you think that's reasonable?
Mm-hmm.
It goes through that committee. Then no one can accuse that officer or that small group of officers of somehow self-dealing or something.
Mm-hmm.
The committee approves it, and then that would be it,
Mm-hmm.
in my view.
Yeah.
And I would have a whole bunch of, it would be much more efficient to have ex post facto filters
Mm-hmm.
than it is to have ex ante
Mm-hmm.
1,000-page rule books and years-long processes.
So yeah, I thought that I with a co-author wrote an article about bureaucratic autonomy and talked about the different methods. And so one way of limiting discretion is by ex ante rules. Another is by ex post review.
Right.
And at first I thought that yes, it's better to shift the burden to ex post review, but we have a lot of systems that have too much ex post review. You know, where a good example of this is the MSPB, the Merit System Protection Board or something. So if a manager wants to fire an employee, the employee can appeal, and it goes through several layers of appeal within the agency, and eventually it can go to this board, and the board hasn't had a leader and hasn't made any decisions in years.
Right. Well, first of all, there can be too much of anything, so including ex post review. But one of the fallacies of that particular process is it assumes that it's a matter of proof. And so in my world of what a new sensible system of government looks like, the ex post review is judgment-based, not legal proof-based.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a matter of the whoever the reviewing body is looking at it and using their judgment, not having a legal trial.
Mm-hmm.
So then it's one layer and it's judgment based, and it won't always work out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Things life is filled with failure as well as success,
Mm-hmm.
but at least it won't be tied down in this or sinking in this quicksand of process and bureaucracy, which is what's happened to even the most mundane decisions today.
Yeah. I'm curious about what you think about some of the big legal decisions that the Supreme Court is going to make. So, for example, we've had this SCOTUS ruling since whatever it was, 84, Chevron deference, that basically said that if a bureaucracy makes a decision and it meets a certain test of sensibility, reasonableness, then you're going to defer to that agency because they have the expertise and not review it judicially. But conservatives really hate this. The betting is that this Supreme Court in its current session is probably going to invalidate Chevron deference.
Right. It's, well, I think it's less important than other people think it is, because I think in reality what judges do is ask themselves, does this make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Even with Chevron in place, they would say, does this make sense? I do think that it will encourage more challenges of agency actions by people who don't like the rules. I'm not confident that it will shift the opinions that maybe it'll shift the opinions on the really important cases because there's no deference now, so it will make a difference then. But for the average case, just like with the average case before the Supreme Court, it's not closely divided. Most cases are 9-0 or 8-1. I think that'll be true in most agency challenges as well. But I suspect it will be important in the big cases, and there's another discussion that we could have, which is about the role of Congress and the role of agencies and how Congress could be reorganized to better oversee lawmaking by the agencies. They delegated lawmaking, so in our theory of the Constitution, they ought to have some sort of oversight over the lawmaking, since the Congress is the lawmaking body. And it's a practical matter today, they really don't. And so that's why we're in this mess where Chevron becomes important, because Congress kicks lawmaking over to the agencies, over the executive branch. And so now who's going to decide it?
Yeah.
Another branch that shouldn't be lawmaking, which is the courts.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't want to get too technical here, but there is the Administrative Procedure Act, which is a structured system for reviewing agency decisions to make sure they're not purely arbitrary, getting notice and comment and so forth.
And it's also very procedure-based. If we could sort of close our eyes and zoom forward with the Jetsons into a future, simpler legal structure, you would have a much more principles-based system that didn't require 1,000-page rule books, where public goals were implemented by officials who had the, I'll call it, presumptive authority to make decisions, subject to some check and balance. And you wouldn't be arguing over, I mean, some of the regulations are tens of thousands of pages long. And so we're arguing the details of these things are just extraordinary. Law doesn't have to work that way in most situations.
Okay, here's an idea. My colleague Mike Bannon, who's an expert on infrastructure, we co-wrote a piece for this California 100 project out of the Goldman School at Berkeley about how the state of California could fix its governance institutions. And we had a slightly different way of holding officials accountable. So you had this exact problem that you couldn't make decisions because there were too many procedures and rules that required, constant review and so forth. And we thought that there ought to be, so for example, for a big infrastructure project, there ought to be something like an elected infrastructure czar who had the authority to actually cut through all the nonsense and, because that's something you can't codify in a rule. I mean, you're balancing the general interest in having the infrastructure against all the particular needs, and you got to make a decision on that. But the accountability mechanism is not a review board. It's actually making that official an elected official, and if you don't like the way that person is balancing these different interests, you don't elect them again.
Yeah, that's interesting. First of all, I like that idea. I've been thinking about an aspect of it. We've been talking today about the agency of individuals and individual officials, but there's also a problem in the modern state, which is kind of unavoidable because of the complexity of interrelated markets and societies, that government is divided into all these different silos. So it's probably literally unlawful to get a permit for a transmission line. There's just too many different conflicting rules and levels of government. Homelessness is a problem that involves police, healthcare, middle workers, building codes. Can you build SRO housing? Social workers. I mean, zoning. There are all those things, and they're all in different silos. And you need to actually combine. You need a structure. I'll call it authority structure. You know, where people can make the trade-offs in order to solve that problem. And I'd love to work with you and your group about coming up with a mechanism like the one you just mentioned. Maybe it's an elected official, maybe it's a board that's subject to the governor or something, but they actually have the authority to make trade-offs that do not, in a strict sense, comply with all the rules of all these different silos, because they can't.
Yeah, well, I think we desperately need some kind of mechanism like that to cut through. But, you know, the other thing that I find challenging in your argument is to convince Americans, you know, that they need to get away from all these rules, because they want contradictory things. You know, they want complete accountability. They don't want the government to make mistakes, but they also hate rules and procedures and, you know, bureaucrats that are telling them that, you know, it's 5 o'clock and therefore I'm leaving and I'm not going to talk to you even though you've been waiting online for 2 hours.
Right. There's David Hume, the Scottish philosopher David Hume, observed years ago that, centuries ago, that people are mightily addicted to rules, particularly when it's not them. You know, so there's this natural, just like, the overweighting of low probabilities, of risks and such that Kahneman talked about and others. So there is this human instinct. I think there does need to be a kind of what I call moral leadership, of moral people, moral authority talking about things. And I think that probably the way to do any of this is to do it in pilot projects where you say, well, just for this state or just for this period, we're going to put in this new simplified version, and we're going to leave all the other law in place. We're just going to see how this works out for a couple of years or whatever it happens to be. And then if it works out well, as I think it'll be, 1/3 the cost and much better, then you can simply let the other thing drift away and make it whole.
Well, we had a kind of example of that, right, with the I95 Bridge rebuilding. Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania basically got it rebuilt in 2 weeks by suspending most of the permitting rules that were required by law.
Yeah, so here's a gas truck explodes underneath the interstate highway in this big metropolitan area. It's going to cost, the estimate was that it'd be traffic jams for a year, because of this, right? Yeah. And we can talk about the Baltimore Bridge. It's the same harder problem. And Josh Shapiro, the young Democratic governor, came in with his transportation commissioner. He said, I declare this a state of emergency. And the transportation commissioners that lived there, and he just spent the day waiving rules. Somebody had an idea of refilling the gap between it was below a highway, with glass because dirt would be too heavy. There was no process for that. Just made a decision. Found some recycled glass, which is expensive, but bought it. Trucks came day and night with recycled glass so they could build a thing. Every rule was waived. I mean, it's not like they went through a process. They just waived it. And then finally, he wanted to open it. I forget what day he was going to open it, but it was 12 days later, and it started raining, and the asphalt wouldn't dry. And he said, I really wanted to open this on a certain day or something. So then the somebody had the idea of using the racetrack dryer from the Pocono Raceway. And the Pocono Raceway say, sure, you can have it for free. And they send it over. So they get some generators, more procurement with no process. Dried it out. 12 days later, it's a ribbon cutting of the highway.
And it seems to me that kind of success would build on itself if people can see, we got results by doing this.
Yes, that's right. So clearly with infrastructure, I'm just writing something now on this where I'm recommending a national infrastructure board that would oversee, that wouldn't have power to either allocate money but it would recommend and comment. So it would be it would kind of goose the process along in all these situations. And talk about trade-offs. It's really important to have a mechanism, as you were described in your article, where there's where there's someone at the top who's saying, here are the trade-offs that make sense. Let's do it this way, and make the kind of judgments that Governor Shapiro made in Pennsylvania and actually get stuff built.
Yeah, well, that's something that is an innovation that seems very hard to get to in our. I mean, you can do it in an emergency where everybody can see the necessity of moving quickly, but in normal politics, all of the interest groups will kick in and, slow things down.
Yes. So I think we're at a point in our society where we can stipulate that Washington will not solve these problems. There are 10,000 interest groups there dedicated to the status quo. It's incredible how little money it takes to stop something. It's almost impossible to get something done, even a little thing, but it's very easy to stop something. So you can practically feel the ground shaking from the populist resentment that's become a kind of contagion, right, in our society. And people, that's why Trump's so popular, I think. But where's the new vision? Where's the vision that actually talks to the ineffectiveness of government? Where's the vision that talks to the alienation of Americans who don't like Big Brother breathing down their necks and all day long and such? Where's the vision that gives back to communities a sense of ownership of dealing with, say, the homelessness or whatever the problem is? And I think that requires something new, and it requires people like you and other people with moral authority or thought to be experts to talk about it's time for system change. It's time to have a change to make things work again, and we have to acknowledge that this is not a matter of tweaking things. It's a matter of it's like an addict. We have to come to grips with our own addiction. In this case, it's an addiction to too much law.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Philip, as a lawyer, I think you can speak with some authority about the fact that there is too much law. I think that we are used to defending the rule of law, and we all understand why that's absolutely critical in a constitutional republic of the sort that we have. But you can have too much of a good thing, as you say, and I think good governance is really a matter of finding the right balance between, say, checks and balances on the one hand and actually effective outcomes on the other.
Yeah, the proof is in the pudding. And law is a framework for freedom. And so the litmus test to me, more broadly, do people feel free to do what's right? And when it comes to officials and others in society, are people free to do what they think makes sense in the situation in front of them? And by those tests, the system is not working.
Right. Okay, Philip, so its book is Everyday Freedom. It's only 80-some pages long, so you can read it in a couple of hours, and it's well worth your time. So thanks very much for talking to me. We are in the process of a prolonged conversation about how to fix, these aspects of American government, and so I look forward to continuing the talk, down the road.
It's great working with you.
Okay, thanks.